morning, everybody. Welcome to Breaking Points, where we have an extra special show planned because we have celebrity guest host Marshall Kosloff, longtime friend of the show and friend also of soccer, sitting in this morning. Great to see you, Marshall.
Yeah, I'm excited to be here. I moved out to Texas. I had a kid. I have a mustache. So everything is different. Everything has changed. And I'm excited to be back on the show.
Yeah, it's going to be a lot of fun. So Marshall, if you guys don't know, hosts the Realignment. He also is deep in the abundance world. So I'm really excited to talk to you about some of that because I've been listening, I told you, to your episodes on abundance on the Realignment. And it's actually helped me much better to understand what's going on inside the movement and what it's all about. So you can be a little bit of our guide through abundance world today, which I'm excited about. In addition, before I forget, guys, announced this yesterday, we brought back the monthly subscription, which I'm super excited about. I think it comes at a really timely moment when, economics are a little uncertain. That's actually what we're starting the show with today. And we are doing a free monthly trial right now. So if you want to try out being a premium Breaking Point subscriber, go to breakingpoints.com. The promo is BP free, so you can get that monthly trial subscription. All right, so here's what is in the show today. Let's go ahead and put the show bar up so I can read it and not have to use my memory, which is a little bit suspect. We're going to talk about the latest with regard to tariffs, some back and forth with China. We've got the continued fallout from that extraordinary Ukraine drone attack. Wanted to get Marshall's take on that in particular, and some reaction from Steve Bannon. That was kind of interesting. We're going to dig into that New York City mayoral race, which is tightening between Andrew Cuomo and Zoran Mamdani. A lot of really interesting dynamics there. I think that will lead us into a great discussion I'm looking forward to on abundance, what it is, what it isn't, how the left should really be thinking about it. And then we're going to thank Marshall for his time and let him go about his day. And Ken Klippenstein is going to join to break down what's going on with Palantir. Looks like the Trump administration is trying to assemble a mass database of all of the information that they have on every single American. Yes, you should be terrified about that. I certainly am. So Ken is going to talk about that, and he is also going to talk about Matthew Miller, former State Department spokesperson under Joe Biden, basically admitting that he was lying the entire time he was at the podium and asserting that Israel had committed no war crimes. So definitely want to take a look at that. So Marshall, before we jump into the news, a lot of Rising and Breaking Points fans know you already. You've undergone, as all of us have, I think, somewhat of a political evolution over the years since you started being a guest on the show. So before we jump in, why don't you just sort of set up for everybody who you are, where you were, where you are now, and kind of your general view of politics in this moment?
Yeah, totally. So I think for a lot of people, the 2016 election was really huge, as it should have been, if you sort of were a person who could see both Trump and Bernie, if you just were comfortable with your perspectives and thoughts and evaluations of the world before that, and that did not at all change by 2016, then I think there was probably something wrong with you. So Sagar and I have known each other forever, so we started a podcast called The Realignment, and The Realignment was really rooted in responding to this 2016 moment from both the right and the left. And I think as someone who's sort of contrarian by nature, I'm from the center-left Portland suburbs, I was really attracted to the right, especially in the 2010s, after the 2012 election, where everything was up for grabs, right? Like Mitt Romney loses to Obama. You have gay marriage passing at the Supreme Court. It seemed like we were moving in one direction as a country, in a more progressive direction by 2050. So the question of how would the right respond to that moment, I think, was genuinely the most fascinating question of the time. Then that really got me into those spaces. I covered a lot of those topics. The Realignment's first guest was J.D. Vance before he was, I met J.D. before he was famous, but our first guest after J.D. was a little more famous was J.D. on the show. So covering that space was huge. After 2020, though, I think obviously what kind of happened with everything from January 6th to sort of COVID, I think made pretty clear that the, I think, most hopeful version of that right populist project wasn't going to end well for anyone. It wasn't going to lead to a stronger, united America. It was just leading to more division and a lack of actual certainty on these questions. So I started just getting more interested in the left and frankly started going back to my roots. So just in the same way that 2013 was this big era where the central questions were, how would the right respond respond to how the 2012 election really shattered their story. The question right now is, how is the center left, how is the center, how is the center right, and how does like the further parts of the left I think you represent really well, how are they going to respond to that moment? So I think my politics have naturally drifted towards where the big questions are.
Interesting. Okay, excellent. Well, with that being said, let's go ahead and jump into some of what is going on with the Trump administration that I'm anxious to get Marshall's thoughts on in particular. Let's go ahead and put this up on the screen. So we have an update on how they are thinking about the tariff regime. And you will recall that there was a series of court decisions that were impactful here. So you had one court, the Court of International Trade, that came in and said, okay, you can't actually use this particular provision that you're using. You have vastly exceeded your authority. You can't do that to levy the Liberation Day tariffs. Another appeals court came in and said, well, you can do it for now while this is playing out in court. So the big question has been, how is the Trump administration going to respond? Are they basically going to take the out and be like, oh, well, we tried and we're just going to move on now? And effectively, all the indications are that they are not going to go in that direction. So that tear sheet that was up on the screen indicates that they want to have countries provide their quote-unquote best offer on trade negotiations by Wednesday, as in tomorrow, as officials seek to accelerate talks with multiple partners ahead of a self-imposed deadline in just 5 weeks, according to a draft letter to negotiating partners seen by Reuters. So effectively, they're saying that on the Liberation Day, which the tariffs went into effect on April 9th. They're giving them a deadline till July 8th. And then if there isn't some sort of deal into place, Trump is going to levy whatever tariffs he decides to levy. A bunch of administration officials, including Howard Lutnick, have been asked about the court ruling and if it makes a difference in terms of how they go about this. And effectively, they're all saying, no, we're going to do what we want regardless of what the courts say, and we'll figure out some other provision to use if it isn't IEPA, which was the original provision. Let's go ahead and take a listen to that.
Congress gives the president, under this IEPA authority, the ability to take on other countries who are creating a national emergency. And the $1.2 trillion trade deficit and all the underlying implications of that is a national emergency. It's gutting our manufacturing base. The president takes that on, and Congress lets him do it, specifically does not vote to take it away, calls a vote and says he can keep it. So what's going to happen is we're going to take that up to higher courts. The president's going to win like he always does. But rest assured, tariffs are not going away. He has so many other authorities that even in the weird and unusual circumstance where this was taken away, we just bring on another or another or another. Congress has given this authority to the president, and he's going to use it.
And Marshall, my suspicion is that I and others who were thinking that maybe the IEPA court ruling would be like an excuse for the Trump administration to back off of this were probably mistaken, and they probably are going to just figure out some other way to accomplish this. Because ultimately, I'm curious, I want to know your thoughts on what really is going on here. I think Trump loves the tariffs because it consolidates a lot of power in his hands, and I don't think that he is going to let go of that easily.
I think it's not just the fact that he loves the power and using the executive branch over Congress. I think it's that I'd say there are probably two things we could reasonably say Trump 120% believes.
Yeah.
It's tariffs and immigration. We should also understand that because Trump had a first term and an interruption between his first and second term, I think he's coming into this administration, and they've made very clear that this is their priority. They see tariffs and immigrations as their unfinished business that they did not get done. Therefore, they are going to push as hard as they can on this issue. That's just like the number one thing here. If you don't understand that Trump just truly believes in this more than almost anything else, you're going to sort of miss the fact that they're going to keep pushing forward.
Yeah, and to be honest with you, I actually think he believes in tariffs more than I think immigration is more a means to an end for him, because even at times there, like he told the All-In guys, the thing about we're going to staple a green card to every, student who graduates. In practice, his administrations are obviously very hardline anti-immigrant, and I think he's basically outsourced that portfolio to Stephen Miller, who is a psycho and a white nationalist and is, going full force with the anti-immigrant program that he wants to. But it seems like the part of the agenda that Trump has really taken the most interest in and actually asserted himself in is the tariffs. And so what is your view, Marshall, of, the tariff program, of the possibilities for it? Do you see any upside here? What is your kind of like broad view of what's going on and what the impact could be economically?
Yeah, no, so right before the election, when Sagar and I were talking about this on the realignment, we really focused on the fact that if we want to understand the story of the modern American presidency, it's that when you come into your second term, or even in your first term of Biden, presidents are going to just have like a theory of the case. And in 2005, after George W. Bush won, his big theory of the case was, I won, I have my mandate, I won the popular vote this time, I'm going to do a Social Security reform, even though the voter base wasn't actually there. In this case, and you see this, leading up to the, 2024 election, Trump's theory of the case was, once again, I'm coming back, I'm going to finish the job. And this has been something I've talked about since the 1980s when we were talking about Japan and other East Asian countries. I am going to pass tariffs. I'm going to reindustrialize America by taking that specific route. That has always been his sort of approach. And the big problem with these like mandate theories and these big, like, this is my big agenda project that I come in, is if that mandate or that idea isn't actually synced with what the American people are feeling, you're going to run into a huge issue. The huge issue they run into is that if there's one lesson, and we'll talk about this during the Zoran segment, if there's one lesson that we should take from the 2024 election, it's that pretty much the main thing Americans care about is how unaffordable everything is right now at every single level. And it's easy for people in the Trump administration just to say like, oh, these cheap goods, and do you need $30? You should just have $2. If we look at like what's happened in America over the past 50 years, like education, healthcare, housing, in those sectors, everything has gotten way, 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 way more expensive. The one thing we've actually kind of kept relatively cheap at the cost of manufacturing, at the cost of like, in many ways, like our domestic politics and domestic economy have just been these consumer goods.
Right.
So coming out of the COVID supply shock, coming out of Biden ignoring this issue, we needed to pay attention to it, having your theory of the case be, I'm going to launch a massive trade war within the first 3 months without doing the long-term planning, without getting the industrial policy together, without going to companies and businesses, even some of the small businesses. I'm sure you saw a lot of those small business owners who voted for Trump saying, wait a second, like, I wasn't ready for this.
Right.
I needed time to prepare for this. And what's really frustrating and crazy about the whole program here is that even if you buy Trump's case for tariffs, this is just not the way you would actually do this. The starts and stops, 90 days. No, we're extending 90 days. Actually, no, we're going to get this other deal. Tariffs and reindustrialization and bringing manufacturing jobs back to this country is a medium-term project. Starting a new factory, rejigging your supply chains. That is so complicated and such a heavy lift for small, medium, and large businesses that you have to have a consistent policy so they can make investment decisions based off of it. If you and I were going to launch a factory in Ohio, we would not launch a factory based on this current dynamic, because we could have an entire situation where if you'd premised your reindustrialization plans on what was happening in February, March, and April, you could be totally screwed right now.
Yeah.
Because, wow, are those tariffs going to be there? Is it going to make sense? Is he going to get a big deal? And the last part here, too, is that in many ways, the big problem of his trade policy is they're doing so many different things at once. So on the one hand, the tariffs could serve as a new form of revenue that could lead to like a income tax decrease. But if we're like actually decreasing the income tax and we're actually like making money from this, then that's not going to reindustrialize the country. Right. So it doesn't really make sense. And you really needed a different version of this administration that actually took those 3 months to say, we're doing these 5 things, they make sense for this reason, and we're going to stay strong on it.
And here's the other thing, and guys, let's skip ahead to A5. Like, if your goal is reindustrializing the country, you're already failing. So this US ISM manufacturing imports index fell to 39.9, lowest level since 2009. COBEC letter says this, we're seeing 2008-like contraction in manufacturing imports as tariffs take effect. The overall measure of manufacturing has been falling month after month after month. And the reality is, Marshall, like, the Biden industrial policy plus protectionism in certain key sectors was actually working. Like, for the first time in modern history, we came out of a recession, the COVID recession, creating more manufacturing jobs than we went in. In recent modern history, typically what happens is there's a recession, manufacturing drops, and it never comes back, right, for a variety of reasons. And this was the first time that they had bucked that trend. And when you're talking about EVs, when you're talking about battery production, when you're talking about green energy, when you're talking about semiconductors, the policy was actually working because you paired the protectionism with industrial policy. And that's the piece that's completely missing here, is any sort of a strategic direction. And at the same time, the parts of that Biden policy, which I'm first to say was like inadequate and more should be done, and it wasn't transformational for people in their daily lives, and and wasn't sold well, all of those things. But the parts that were actually working are also being attacked and dismantled by a Trump administration, which just, hates Joe Biden, hates green energy, anything that smacks of like liberalism, like EVs, EV batteries, any sort of green energy, they just want to destroy. And so they've taken a chainsaw to those pieces and, are actually destroying the part of our industrial policy that was actually working.
Yeah, and the thing is of Bidenomics, we should think about it on two different levels. So level one was like the political project. Biden's going to bring all the jobs back. We're going to reindustrialize America from sort of a center-left perspective. That political project totally failed. It didn't deliver. It didn't deliver fast enough. I have a lot of MAGA in-laws, and if you tell them about the actual policies that Joe Biden pursued, they are literally skeptical and do not believe it was happening because you just didn't see this. There's lots of really great reporting on how, despite the fact that they put a lot of these jobs in red states and in purple and swing states, it just wasn't actually felt on the ground. So at a political level, it did not work. At a policy level, I think what's been so frustrating about covering this tariff topic is if you actually talk to most people, left, right, and center, what they will say is, wow, we actually came to kind of a consensus after the first Trump administration and the Biden administration. The Biden administration could have jettisoned all of Trump's tariffs when they came in 2021. They didn't, though. They kept them because they, A, bought into the idea that we couldn't just treat China entering the world market as this chill thing that was going to work out for everybody and magically keep everyone's jobs together. They kept that part, but then they once again added the government spending and industrial policy side. So we found a mix that, to your point, needed to be implemented better. So in a better version of the Trump administration, to the point I was saying earlier, you would have said, okay, here's what didn't work with the Biden approach. Here's what didn't work with our approach in the first term. Let's combine this into a mix that actually builds us into something productive. And the key thing here, there was consensus in the business community, in the labor, with labor, and with policymakers on the left and right around that mix. Jettisoning it just because it's Bidenomics or because it's Biden tied is a huge disaster.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about the China relationship a little bit more. I can put A3 up on the screen. So we have indication here. Trump and Xi may talk very soon. We'll see. In addition, this was the big news that came out yesterday. I can put A3B up on the screen. Trump has extended the China tariff. So pushing it off into the future, allow more time for negotiation, pushing it off till August 31st. And then this was pretty remarkable in terms of global impact on view of the U.S. since Trump has come back into office. Net favorability, this is, again, global average net favorability. This is a poll conducted by Morning Consult. The U.S., when Trump comes into office, the view of the U.S. falls off a freaking cliff. And at the same time, the view of China has been significantly on the rise. So now you have a positive, almost 9-point margin in favor of China, and the U.S. is underwater at minus 1.5, which is no surprise, Marshall, when he, again, with the incoherence of the trade policy, it would be one thing if you're like, we're going to specifically focus on China. We're going to create a block of our allies to, have some policy solidarity and to try to isolate China. But instead they went to war with the entire world, including Canada and the EU and countries that only have, places that only have penguins and the whole thing. And so, of course, much of the world is like, screw you, what are you doing? So in that respect, too, it has been thoroughly counterproductive and has really strengthened China's hand going into these trade negotiations.
Yeah, and I think so two examples here. So number one, why were we placing tariffs on Madagascar? It actually does not make sense other than the explanation we gave earlier that Trump just specifically does not like trade in the conventional sense. So it's not just that hey, we have these industries that really matter. Oh, hey, we have this whole part of the country that really relies on these jobs. So we have to balance the trade-offs of cheap goods versus people actually having jobs here. No, Trump just broadly is hostile to trade, which explains why we are doing a trade fight with Mexico, which explains why we're doing a trade fight with Canada. And if you talk to the Canadians specifically, the Mexico side of this thing has always been much more complicated because, going back to NAFTA in the 1990s and then maquiladoras, a lot of jobs went south. So I think people had within their mental framework the idea that, okay, the US and Mexico are going to kind of have a hostile trade relationship. And I think a dynamic where that is a fight doesn't lead to that fall off of like support for the US in terms of these global polls. What the Canada experience just revealed is just like a real lack of trust. Like if you talk to Canadians about this, if you talk to people across the kind of world, they would say, wait, like if they're just coming after us on this, why would we assume they're trying to find the right deal for this?
Right.
Why is this about sort of us getting a good deal with them, us getting something from, us being Canadians, the Canadians, they get something from us, we get something from them. It's all just domestic politics.
Well, and not to mention, so in Trump's first administration, he renegotiated NAFTA with Canada and Mexico. So if you don't like the deal that was struck, like you're the one who struck that deal, buddy. So again, to your point about trust, why should they expect that some new deal that they would enter into this time around would be upheld under this Trump administration, under the next administration, whether it's Democratic or Republican? Like the word of these people is just absolutely no good. Not to mention the just completely like chaotic and schizophrenic nature of how the tariffs are on and off and they're up and they're down and he's chickening out and then he's all in on a day-to-day basis. I am curious, what do you make of the taco discourse? Because I'm actually a little bit skeptical to your point about how Trump is like one thing that he is ideologically committed to is tariffs.
Yep.
And not to mention, if you had told people going into the Trump administration that we would be at the level of tariffs that we're at right now, and this is at a time before, we get to July 8th and he once again does like another Liberation Day announcement or whatever that's going to be, people would be deeply concerned about what that would mean for the economy because it was an extraordinary increase. Even just the levels we're at now are an extraordinary change and increase over where we were previously. So I'm a little bit, I understand where it comes from because he has backed off the most maximalist positions of like 145% tariffs on China, which just completely ended trade between China and the US, which was completely insane. But on the other hand, I think it would be foolish to understate where we are and what he could potentially still do in the future.
Yeah, and I think that's why the court cases really matter here too, because like once again, if we're going to understand like what are the consistent parts of Trump's politics and personality over the past 50 years, he's a negotiator. Now, if I am sitting in China, if I'm sitting in the UK or the EU right now, I'm much less certain that Trump is operating with a full deck of cards here when it comes to the United States. Why is there and this is the danger of just sort of doing this Hail Mary, we're going to reconfigure the way we conceive of trade policy and the trade policy with the administration to do versus actually Congress, because if you get knocked down at the courts, even though those are being paused by the appeals court right now, why would China negotiate? Right. The other thing that really is important here too, and I want to go back to the comment about how China's perception is going up, is that the real problem that we're facing here is that we sort of root our approach to China in sort of two different periods. So a lot of people root their approach to China in 2000. We let them into the WTO. They're a low-cost, cheap manufacturer. They take a bunch of our jobs, and that all basically happens there. In exchange, we get cheap consumer goods. That's one version of China. The second version of China is the China that Trump faced down during the late 2010s. We now, in the year 2025, are facing a new China where they now have BYD, who are producing the best, the cheapest electric vehicles in the world, and they are penetrating the European and the most advanced. They are penetrating European and global markets. So if I'm sitting in, let's say, Germany, or I'm sitting in an East Asian country, and we see China delivering, not just, competing for jobs with us, but actually delivering like industrial, first world technological advancement that the United States cannot match right now, but also weirdly enough, the Trump administration says they are just totally uninterested in.
Right.
China looks really great right now. Like that's just like the key real context here. You can't just treat China like it's the 2000s or the 2018 China.
Or even like I feel like sometimes Trump has this like 1990s view of China almost that is completely out of touch with where they are today. They made an explicit government-led plan to move up the value chain, and they've done it. It's not the days anymore of just like China stealing other companies' IP and using it to, create knockoff cheap versions of it. Like they have their own very high-tech, advanced research capabilities. In some areas, to your point about BYD and EVs, they are outpacing the US. I think they're on par in terms of AI development at the very least. And so this is a very different China, not to mention the trading dynamics have changed as well. The US, if you consider ASEAN as a bloc, the US is no longer China's largest trading partner. They trade more with ASEAN. You have an entire rest of the world. So it was easier for China to acquire more customers than it is for the US to, recreate all of the supply lines and all of the manufacturing capability that has been outsourced to China and other countries too, by the way, over the years. And it always seemed to me wild at the beginning of this that there was so much confidence from the Trump administration that it would be China that would have to come to them and China that would be in the more difficult political position in terms of these trade dynamics, because that too, there isn't public consensus around what Trump is doing. Whereas in China, because we're the instigators here who started this war, there does appear to be a sort of rally around the flag effect and a willingness to, withstand whatever it is the government policy in order to fight back against what the U.S. is doing to them.
Yeah, and there's been some really great reporting from the New York Times that I checked in on. So it's not as if this is just all like a total win for China. Like the Chinese really depend on being able to export goods to the United States. So it's not as if a trade war wouldn't be a disaster for their own economy. But what the Chinese have explicitly done since the last round of these wars back in the 2018 period is they've made their economy more resilient. They've prepped for this. They've set the national narrative. You are not going to see Chinese, aside from the politics of it, you are not going to see Chinese small business owners knocking on Xi's door saying, wait, this is a disaster for us. This doesn't work. So they have set the table to fight an actual trade war. And what we have just literally not done, and I don't care if you're on the right and you object, even if you are on the right and think we need to take a totally different approach to trade, it would have taken multiple years of preparation to actually get our economy to the point where we could stand off against China to your point, to the degree to which Trump wants to trade off on. I want to also go to Letnick's comments about like national security. That's why we need to really do this. I hope no one takes away the idea that you and I are dismissing the idea that there aren't national security concerns here. My favorite topic on this is like we are incredibly dependent on China for pharmaceuticals. It's a huge problem. It's a huge risk. This isn't just like a China-Taiwan thing. This was like a COVID thing. Yeah. Like there are so many critical things that we are over-dependent on China on. And in an era where we have to be ready for supply chains to break at any time, once again, separate from your views of war and peace, we need to be more resilient in that category. The national security emergency supports the argument that, wow, we should really, really concentrate on these 5 specific areas. So once again, like we really, really, really should have focused on semiconductors, which is what the Biden administration was doing. Wow, even if our pharmaceutical goods are cheaper because of the fact that we get them from China, we can't be overly dependent on any one country and all of the chaos that's happening right now. So if they'd come in and said, hey, here are these 5 to 10 areas, we're going to hyper-focus on them, and maybe if it turns out that makes pharmaceutical drugs more expensive because we're reshoring, we'll have some sort of subsidy or pursue some sort of industrial policy for pharmaceutical goods, that would have been met not only with more policy consensus in this country. You wouldn't see the courts fighting. You wouldn't see you wouldn't see even Republicans in Congress fighting. You wouldn't see angry town halls where Republican congressmen and women cannot even articulate the case for this policy. That would have been the right approach here.
Hey, if you like that video, hit the like button or leave a comment below. It really helps get the show to more people.
And if you'd like to get the full show ad-free and in your inbox every morning, you can sign up at breakingpoints.com.
That's right. Get the full show, help support the future of independent media at breakingpoints.com.